Hello, welcome back to Got Melanin with your hostesses with the mostesses, Mari Faines and Melina Villeneuve. Hi, my good sis Mari.
Hey, my good sis Mel. Happy Tuesday.
Happy Tuesday. Happy July 7th. I believe we are not spending any money today.
Amen, amen. No money unless it's in the Black community. It's a good day.
Exactly. Welcome back, therefore, to Got Melanin, like I was saying. Mari, do you want to give the real quick lowdown of what we're all about here?
Oh, we are an organization and a podcast hosted by WCAPS, which is a Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security. This specific podcast is everything melanated, brought to you by women of color for the world.
Yes, absolutely. I can't believe this is already our third episode.
I know everybody listening on Spotify was like, what was that pause? That was me going, what?
That was a great pause. Oh my god, comedic moments for the win. I can't. Yeah, I thought about this yesterday and I was like, I can't believe it's already just like our third one, because last week's podcast. No, last episode, which was 2 weeks ago, was like following our launch event, which went great. And thank you all so much for participating. And again, thank you to the speakers. Mwah, mwah, mwah. But we were tired, man.
Ooh, sis.
Oh my goodness. And I re-listened to it the other day and then just realized so many times that I was just so tired. But obviously it's always so exciting to be able to discuss this with someone like yourself as well.
Back at you, babe. No, I think the launch was amazing. We said it last episode. I will keep saying it until probably forever. And I think that there was so much love and labor put into it that then when we started talking again the next day on the things that we love and find laborious, you guys got us in our most authentic exhaustion working for the things that we care about. And that's the reality. Sometimes on this show, because we are working in labors of love, we're going to be a little tired. But I don't think but I was still glad to have the conversation with you. I cannot lie.
Yeah. Despite the emotional labor, it is still just like such don't want to say outer body experience or anything, but it is just quite like, I don't know, it's refreshing to be able to discuss these things. And obviously, I don't know, I've come to realize over the last couple of weeks that I'm extremely grateful, no matter how painful it has been to have this growth. Like,
no, I completely agree with you. And honestly, I think us being able to admit that sometimes this movement makes you tired is the best thing that we could possibly do, because it is unapologetically authentic. And for everybody, as we said in the last episode, for everybody whose timeline is going back to normal, Black lives still matter today. They mattered yesterday. They mattered 10 years ago, tomorrow, and forevermore. And I think now more than ever is when you have to admit that sometimes you're going to get weary, and that's when you have to keep going. You and I talked about this probably yesterday when we were on the phone, per usual. And we are still doing things like fighting for justice for Elijah McClain and Breonna Taylor. For Breonna Taylor, we're over 100 days in.
Yeah.
And we still have not gotten any charges. We got a lot of pretty murals, but we don't have any charges.
We got how many? 37 cities that have Black Lives Matter painted on like their longest street and stuff. Beautiful, wonderful. Change legislation. Arrest her murderers. Like, arrest the people who killed Elijah McClain. Like, I'm sorry, but they were not protecting anyone. There was no protection there.
Honestly, Ayanna Presley tweeted this, and shout out to Ayanna Presley. We are so thankful for you. She said 37 cities and counting have Black Lives Matters on their city streets. One state has dealt with qualified immunity. One. And for those of you who do not know, qualified immunity was created during the civil rights era. It basically keeps people in government immune from civil suits and liability. The whole idea was during the civil rights era, they didn't want cops being involved in frivolous civil suits. Most recently in the 2000s plus, we've seen it play out in the cases where there are police involved shootings. Because as we noted last episode, we know that most cases where police officers are involved are in murders or in shootings in general. There are no charges brought, which means no criminal charges brought, which means the only way to get justice or redress would be to go through civil action. And with qualified immunity, that is a law that is pretty much prohibiting that from happening. So that is why today, Mel and I said, let's break it down for people. Let's talk about this legislation. Let's talk about this policy. Because like we said last week, police brutality is the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, completely. And I think, our episode title for today, Jim Crow Isn't Dead. Oh, I know. I'm sorry. Hold yourselves back. It's okay. Everything's fine. Shook. But the fact of the matter is that, he isn't. The idea behind those laws and the idea behind that kind of segregation and the idea behind that kind of, formalizing discrimination and oppression still exists today. It might not necessarily exist in the form of, specific outright laws like that, but it is very much still something that's in play. And I'm starting to realize also that it's more of a cultural Jim Crow. Do you see what I mean? Because, the U.S. is, I don't even know how to unpack that, to be quite honest with you, because that's a whole lot of what. But at least in Europe, do you know what I mean? There's not, you don't have these laws of, people will live here or, only these kinds of people will get these jobs and blah, blah, blah. But there is definitely still this mentality of you're a person of color. You're from one of the colonies. You're not from here. This whole aspect to it, when the fact of the matter is that most people that are out, our age and living in Europe have known nothing other than the country that they live in and that they represent. Do you know what I mean? You might have yes, of course, roots that are not from here or from this country, but at the end of the day there's a cultural identity, and I think that that's where things get muddled, is that there's an ethnic identity, which frankly I like to think of it as just kind of adding spice to the conversation, oh, I also have I'm from here and I know of this culture or this area or this thing. And then there's so there's the cultural identity, and then there's the ethnic identity, and I think that the cultural identity is where things get kind of muddled, and then we have these ideas of what we think a citizen from England or France or Germany or Greece or Sweden or Portugal looks like, when in reality your ancestors took all your culture, put it in a bag, in a rucksack, hopped on a boat, went to a foreign land, and we're I baptize you with all of this. Nah. Now it's time to, you spread your culture. Congratulations. It's you've created, something that was far and wide reaching. So I think it's in that sense, it's you were saying, today we're going to be discussing legislation, but it's also just the idea that even past legislation, whether or not it's still active, has had this cultural, societal effect on how we treat various members of the population. Does that make sense?
No, I understand where you're going. And you talked a lot about how colonizers, because that's what we're referring to right now, went to other countries and decided this is now mine, and then decided who got to be citizens in the capital W West. And that does tie back really nicely to America. I know you said you didn't want to dissect it, but you did a great little segue. But that makes me think, right? So we said we're on July 7th. Last weekend was the 4th of July. I'm not going to lie to you. I've never celebrated 4th of July as anything other than a day to hang out with my family and barbecue, as I know most Black people have. But this 4th of July, I think to a lot of people, not necessarily myself, especially since I was over here in London. So really, what were we doing?
It's a bit awkward to celebrate 4th of July here, isn't it? Yeah.
Not that I was going to celebrate it if I was in Chicago, but still. But it hit differently. So you and I talked about the NPR piece where the descendants of Frederick Douglass read his speech what's the slave in 4th of July? And then my church the next day also read it. And I felt like I was inundated with so many different versions and readings and understandings of this speech. And don't get me wrong, I'd heard it before. It's the case, fact, and matter. But this time, it just hit differently. And you were just talking about who gets to be a citizen, who gets to be a member of this space. And it genuinely takes me to a quote which I highlighted from the speech. And he says, Frederick Douglass says,
I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary.
Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common.
The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me.
I read that. Also, wow, poignant.
Yeah.
Let's just take a pause, run it back if you're on the tape, listen to that again, read it. But I think that's really important because we spent a lot of time over the past few weeks and, as people are learning, talking about things like white privilege, and I think the first place that people get really trumped up or messed up on white privilege is they're like, well, I can't have privilege. I'm a woman. I can't have privilege. I'm socioeconomically disadvantaged. That is not what we're saying. We're not saying that those are not inhibiting factors in your advancement. Yes, when you think about your juxtaposition to white male patriarchy, yeah, okay, you may and likely are facing a disadvantage. But what we are saying is that you have never been given disadvantages solely based on your skin color. There has not been a roadblock placed in front of you just because you have melanin in your skin. And that in its simplest fact takes me back even to Frederick Douglass' times, right? Because at that point, slaves were 3/5 of a person in Congress. And all we've seen since that period, as you said earlier, is the cycle of new laws which continue to tell Black folks in America, you are not afforded those same unalienable rights as put into the United States Constitution. Yeah. And that in itself, I think, is a good place for us to kind of start this conversation, because I know you and I have talked on numerous occasions about you growing up in France or me growing up in the States and understanding what it feels like to be in that nation. And I've explained to you and expressed to you, I recognize that my U.S. citizenship comes with conditions that started with legal practices written in the United States Constitution and have continued with legal practices that get me up until today.
Yeah. No, completely. And I think it is, it's madness to think of it that way, but I completely agree. And I think it is just one of those things where it's like, there's so much, basically, I like what you said about like even just like an ounce of melanin, because that's enough for anyone to start questioning like, what are you? Like when it's like, dude, I'm human. Like there's no reason to try to figure out like whatever. And like personally growing up, I grew up in Mali and Cameroon, would go back to France every summer because my family's from there. And then I grew up in New York as well. And then I went to school in Miami. Every place was entirely different in terms of like how it would not necessarily treat me. Like it's not me specifically, but I take it as like how they would treat someone that has like my complexion or that has like this like ambiguousness. Is that a word? Whatever. Don't know how to speak English, but this like, like you're ethnically ambiguous kind of thing. And at the end of the day, which is something that my dad and I have like unpacked together, is because my dad is like white French, the biggest ally I know, obviously, like shout out to my dad. But he like, there is that sense of confusion of like, but you're like, you're French, you're my daughter, you're half white. Like, he's like, you're literally as white as you are black. And I'm like, yeah, but it doesn't matter because I've said it before, I'll say it again. You have one drop of melanin, it's enough to call you black. The cop, what's his name? King, the guy, the mixed race cop that, like...
Keung.
I think it's pronounced King, but I'm not sure.
Okay.
He is mixed race, and yet, like, he was like, I'm gonna join the force because I believe that I can be that bridge to get, like, you know, between, like, the community, capital C, and the force, capital F. When in reality, he found himself in the situation where he could have spoken up, but he didn't do it. Because I don't even think at that point it's a matter of, like, race, but it's a matter of, like, this hierarchy of, like, there is so much legislation that allows for these powers to be held, and there is so much authorization that is given in these situations because, like, in the case of the United States, it's a massive country. Like, how can you try to police everyone if you've only got, like, one central person that's got all of this power and authorization? Do you know what I mean? Like, had Derek Chauvin not had this, like, authority that he had being at his position and at his rank and stuff, like, I'm not saying, you know, coulda, woulda, shoulda, whatever, but, like, it could have been something different. And I think that it's the idea of, like, you don't question authority. You're grateful for the positions that you're awarded. Like, in his case, it was like, it's, if anything, it's like not even a privilege that you're a part of the force, but like, oh, you get to be the bridge. Like, you know what I mean? Like, at what point would this person speak up and then go against their authoritative figure about this? But sorry, I'm getting carried away.
No. I think you're speaking to exactly what we're talking about, which is systems. You hit the nail on the head, right? We've said this in the last episode about these are systems that are in place. We literally said we recognize, and I'm not calling this person a good person because I don't know them, nor do I want to comment on their status, nor do right now I think they're necessarily a good person. But in general, there are good people who opt to become police officers. But because the system is so crooked and it is so flawed, because as we've said, it was originally based on catching fugitive slaves, there's no way in which, at least at the current juncture, it could operate in a positive manner. And I think about that. And again, I really did read this Frederick Douglass speech, like word, line for line the other night. Because I was like, wow, this is, after Hamilton, this was the fun thing that I did this weekend. And yes, I am a Hamilton stan. I'm not ashamed of it. It's the reality.
You do you, queen.
Thank you. But I was thinking about, you talked about systems that were in place that were clearly different for Black people and for white people. And Frederick Douglass literally alludes to this in his speech. He said there are 72 crimes in the state of Virginia, which if committed by a Black man, no matter how ignorant, are punishable to him by death. Only 2 of the same crimes will subject a white man to like punishment.
That's ridiculous.
So he said that in, I believe it was 1852. And I know a lot of people, hopefully not our listeners, as they are continuing to grow with us, as we continue to have perspectives, because we know we are not experts, we are friends dissecting our perspective, recognize that these systems that he's talking about in 1852 have a legacy which are rooted in today, in 2020. So when we say things like Jim Crow hasn't died, let's look at Jim Crow, right? The 13th Amendment happened, and then we had Reconstruction in Jim Crow from 1876 to 1965. During that time period, when the South looked like it was going to go through some sort of economic depression, the solution was contract prison labor. And at that point, the decision was made, we're going to arbitrarily arrest and charge Black people and give them crazy court fines, which we know that they wouldn't be able to pay. And then suddenly they would become wards of the state. And as we know in the 13th Amendment, which I talked about in the very first episode, that was the one loophole in how you could do slavery. And I think about the case Michelle Alexander talked about in her book, The New Jim Crow. It was Ruffin versus the Commonwealth. It was in 1871. And there's literally a line in there that says, he is, for the time being, a slave to the state. Period.
Nah.
Period. So during this period of Reconstruction, what we saw was prison labor being contracted out to things like railroads and mines and cotton fields. And oftentimes, the labor was more grueling and the conditions were worse than in slavery, because in slavery, there was a financial incentive to keep your slaves healthy, quote unquote. There was no financial incentive in prison labor to do the same thing. So as Douglas Blackman talked about in his book, A Slavery by Another Name, all we saw was as people began to get sick, as people began to die, the sentences for prisoners became longer, they became blacker, and they became younger. And that is the first era of mass incarceration, which gets us legacies like the war on drugs and like today in 2020 when we see new forms of mass incarceration.
Yeah. And that even like, it's even, okay. When you're throwing young Black men in jail like this by the thousands at that point in certain states, you're literally depriving future father figures, current father figures. You're creating a cycle of clueless fatherhood, I want to say, in like the least insensitive way possible. I'm not saying that people are clueless, but how are you supposed to do something when you don't have an example to learn from? And basically, I've been watching the show on Netflix, Black AF, and he literally says that in like one of the episodes, because like the Black dad's like, what the hell? Like, I don't understand why Black moms always get all the praise for being great moms, and then Black dads like don't get any of the same praise. And then it's like this whole thing where he explained basically that like, yeah, you had this system where you had Black men that were being thrown in jail all the time, whether it's through what you just said about prison labor, whether it's through the war on drugs, whether it's through like even the civil rights movement, like with people get like, do you know what I mean? Oh, potential terrorists, whatever. Like it creates a cycle in which there's an absent person, in which there's a missing piece to a whole generation's growth. And yeah, and obviously now it's not necessarily the case. Like, I think, I'm not, like, I've seen numerous examples of just, dads of all colors being awesome. But Black dads especially are just, like, a lot more present now. Like, I mean, as I can see on social media, I don't know, it might be a bit, like, clueless of me to say this, but here we are. And I just find it's really, to say that slavery ended 200 years ago, like, get over it. Ever heard of a legacy? Like, what's left? Like, look at what's happening now. Like, it's not as if, slavery ended 200 years ago, but the laws were still in place. It's just that we didn't call it slavery. We called it something else. We called slaves something else. Do you know what I mean? Like, the name doesn't matter. It's the action. It's the impact. It's the, like, reasons for being, the reasons for putting these things in place.
No, and you're right. And your earliest point where you talk about generationally wiping out people, the war on drugs is a perfect example. It genuinely is. Because let's think about it, right? The first act in the war on drugs was the Anti-Drug Abuse Act in 1986. The whole point was to create harsher penalties. It instituted things like mandatory minimum sentences, which I know I talked about in the first episode, but in case people missed it, and to run it back because it's still really important, at that time, it was things were said where 5 grams of crack and 100 grams of cocaine both equal the same 5-year minimum sentence. Well, some people are going to say it here and be like, oh, well, that makes sense. Well, whose community was infiltrated with the crack epidemic?
Facts.
Black people. Whose community was doing powdered cocaine? White people. So you're telling me both of those two things, there is somehow an equivalency that elects them to have the same minimum sentence. That's also when you saw things like the 3 strikes law go into effect, which I think I again alluded to in the first one, but I can't remember. But the whole idea is if you get 2 felonies, no matter what the third one is, you could be subject to life imprisonment. So we'll use an extreme example. Let's say you're, 17-ish, and you are selling drugs for whatever reason, because a lot of times people are in socioeconomic situations in which they are disenfranchised and cannot operate within the normal economy, so that is your only choice.
And it's a survival thing.
Exactly. We do not dismiss. And you get caught, the prosecutor decides to charge, they convince you, because as we know, prosecutors are the strongest part of the system in the judiciary. They decide, oh, we'll give you parole if you sign and say that you're guilty. Oh, we'll give you a minimum sentence if you sign and say that you're guilty. You, being young and scared, make a decision. You sign. You now have these 2 felonies on your record. You go about your life. Let's say 10, 15 years later, you've fallen on hard times for whatever reason, because again, we know that there are systems inherently working against you, and you steal toothpaste in a Gatorade. You then get caught and charged. That's your 3rd felony. You now, under 3 Strikes Act, should be subject or could be subject to 25 years to life imprisonment.
Okay, see, even, because it was Clinton's administration, right, that put that in place, the 3 strikes rule.
I believe so. The war on drugs is long.
Yeah, but the 3 strikes came in, like, in the 90s.
It's in the later end of the...
Yeah.
Because I have some image of Clinton just standing there going, like, this needs to stop. But anyway.
That sounds about right.
And I never realized that it could be as simple as, like, you pleading guilty to get a lesser sentence. I always thought it was that, like, you were doing... First of all, I never even realized that it was, like, actual felonies. I thought that just kind of applied to, like, any sort of, like, arrest, which freaked me out. But, okay, felonies. But still, man, that's really, like... Oh, that's really frustrating. And, like, I just don't... Yeah, no. That's not cool.
And it's one of those things, right? You just said it, right? You thought it was X, so it could be Y. You thought it must mean this. And that in itself, I am no legal expert. I'm not about to sit up here on this podcast and tell you that I am a legal expert. I did read the new Jim Crow. I have done a lot of research through my own dissertations on this, which is where all these stats are coming from in my perceptions.
Nice.
But even that basic understanding of you as a well-learned and well-read person who is invested in this kind of stuff and cares about things like prison reform didn't necessarily understand the law, right?
Yeah.
You are operating just based on your own academic background with more of an understanding than your average person. And oftentimes in these proceedings, people aren't told that fact, right? You're told you're getting, this is going to help you in the long run because it's going to give you a lesser sentence, because it's going to put you on parole, whatever. But the long-term ramifications of that action is not explained. And when I think about stuff like the long-term ramifications, right? We think about, like, in the 88, I think it's like 88 in the anti-drug bill, they introduced civil penalties, right? Which stopped, if you have a felony, it stopped people from being able to get things like student loans, live in public housing. It puts different types of barriers on social benefits. So now we've got people who are literally trapped within a system. Because let's say you do your time, you come out, you then have the issue of trying to find a job because you're on parole, trying to find housing, and you already have all of these cards stacked against you. This is how people continue to fall into the informal economy, because you are not creating space for them in the formal economy. And I'm sure people think about these things and like, oh, well, this affects all people. Well, who is the majority of the prison population right now? Who was the majority of the war on drugs? Who was that geared towards? That's Black people. These are systems and policies and laws which are disproportionately affecting Black people, especially Black men. And we haven't even touched yet, which I'm sure we'll touch in a second, like voter disenfranchisement as it affects not only prisoners, but regular Black folk.
Yeah.
But that's what we're talking about when we said police brutality was the lowest rung on the totem pole. These laws that we're talking about, these policies, these reenactments of a new Jim Crow as these systems and cycles continue to switch, continue to die. This is what we're saying when we are fighting for systemic change. These things are deeply entrenched and deeply rooted in our judiciary and in, as you referenced earlier, our cultural psyches. They're not weird, they're norms. That in itself is a problem.
Yeah, here. Absolutely. No, that's so true. And it is, yeah, it's gotten to the point now where, like, you see a statistic. I'm not going to try to make one up because there's no point. But you see a statistic, you see a number, and you're not necessarily shocked by it. Like yesterday, I was looking up like the unemployment rates, percentages, however you'd like to describe it, like by race in the UK, because yeah, I guess UK, US are still like very much into identifying which race you belong to, but that's a question for another day.
Literally sips tea.
To be tabled. Yeah, sip your tea. It's all good. And it was something like 9% of the Black population in the UK is unemployed, which is the highest percentage. And obviously in my like Black consciousness, like Black power mind, I'm like, this is unacceptable. But had I read this in any other context, would I have blinked? Do you know what I mean? Would you necessarily, sit there and think like, that is so weird. Like, why is that so much higher up? And it's like, oh, because it's like you said, there is no space in the formal economy that is created for people of color, and especially for Black people. Like, point blank period, with the T at the end. So it's quite like, again, in my mindset yesterday, I was like, oh my gosh, this is insane. But then I thought about it and I was like, okay, what if I was just reading like a news article that was just saying like throwing in that stat? I would have thought, oh wow, yeah, okay, that's like 1/10 of the Black population. 1/10 of the Black population. Do you see what I mean? Like, it's madness to think that it's like basically that number. And we don't blink. We just go, yeah, that's so true. Wow. Anyway.
No, but see the reason, and to stick on that point, because I want you to tell me more about the UK, because we do live here and people do care, and people need to recognize that it is not just an American problem. It is a capital W West problem.
Yeah.
But the reason for you that you say that it doesn't necessarily stick out is because you already recognize that systems are stacked against Black people. So it is not necessarily shocking to you to hear that their unemployment is higher. It is angering to you because you recognize that that is a problem and that is not fair. And there's a difference between those two reckonings, right? There's a difference of people who would read that statistic and are like, oh my God, how could this be? Wow. And there's a difference between being like, this is incredibly frustrating because I know the reason that my community is having these problems is because we are systemically and systematically disenfranchised. And that's that reckoning that you're having, right? If you read that, you were like, I have to do something, I have to change, right? Like I have to help make change. Other people are going to read that and it is going to be their first time realizing that there might be systems which are specifically disenfranchising Black people. They might read that and be like, oh, I wonder why that is. That's crazy. Black people know why that is. I know why that is. I know why it's like that in America. It's for all of these reasons and these laws that I've listed for you, and a bunch of them that we haven't even gotten to yet.
Yeah. Yeah, literally. I don't know. It's so interesting. Again, like, I'm not saying that we have the best podcast / show ever, but I'm saying that, like, it is very interesting, especially in this time, and the fact that we both live in the UK, to see the extent to which it is not entirely different here than it is in the US. It's just a lot more polite. And it's just a lot more like, oh, you know, we don't do that. That's an American thing. Because, and I think, I don't remember if we mentioned this just in conversation, the two of us, but yes, we mentioned this yesterday. But it's this concept of like, I think the reason, that's my personal opinion, but I think the reason to that is because countries in Western Europe, right? Mm-hmm. So UK, France, Germany, etc., have existed for centuries, like centuries longer than the United States. But it's almost as if they both reached that like colonial imperialism, like, you know, what's the word? Like expansion around the same time, both like economically and like physically and, you know, like just, yeah, that influence and that power, right? But I think because the US has formally existed for less longer, it's just a lot more vibrant and like flagrant and a lot more visible. Whereas here, you know, I'm thinking especially in the case of France, for example, like we had, in World War II, we had laws discriminating against Jews because, you know what I mean? We were occupied by the Germans. That was real legislation. And like, it's not as if it's not mentioned, but then if you utter the word racism in France, you're looked at as if you just like, you're blasphemous. Because there's no such thing as racism in this country because we don't recognize race anymore. We're just all citizens under the same republic. Do you see what I mean? It's like this erasure of like very real past, and whether it's like recent past or like very far away past, but it's this erasure of this past because since World War II, which is clearly the very defining pivotal moment in Western Europe's like race relations, we don't discuss these things anymore, and we don't discuss them because they don't exist anymore because we've moved past it. But in reality, no, we've just gotten more tolerant. And I say that with a little t because the reality is that like tolerance does not equal acceptance, does not equal like equality, does not equal justice. Tolerance just means like I will not beat your face in. Sick. Thank you so much. That's so kind. Because now that's like a criminal offense. So like in the case of the UK, and this is where I pull out my notes.
We love this.
So there was like the Race Relations Act, which was in like 1965 and stuff. And I'm getting like all of this information from an article that your wonderful partner Wale sent over. But it was written by Jenny Bourne in 2015 for the Institute of Race Relations. So just want to throw that out there. But essentially, as of 1965, discrimination based on like color, race, ethnicity, and like national origin was outlawed. Okay. But this was in public spaces, okay? So it's not a situation where it's like, you know, again, you say that way and it's like, oh, well, yes, of course, okay. Your immediate thought, which was my immediate thought, was like, anything outside of my home is public space, therefore I will not be discriminated against. No. Right. Because it didn't include employment situations. It didn't include housing. It only basically talked about like, yeah, public, outdoors, kind of like discrimination. And the thing with this Race Relations Act as well is that it actually, if anything, went to like intensify immigration controls. And it went to like intensify that notion of like, who is British? Like, what is British? Do you know what I mean? Not what is, but like what constitutes Britishness. So you get this criminal offense like in public spaces, but in reality, like, yeah, people were still being discriminated when it comes to employment. People were still being discriminated against when it came to housing. And I'm not saying that, like, you know, the police weren't doing anything or anything like that. I wasn't there, so I can't, like, speak on the time or the matter. But if it's only a question of, like, public space, you know, the thing with legislation is that it's all about interpretation when you then use it and when you then apply it. What is a public space? What constitutes a public space? A park? A pub? A Tesco's? Like...
That was going to be my question. If it didn't include things like employment and housing, then are you literally just saying you can't discriminate against me when I'm walking down the street?
Essentially, yeah.
And
so
this
also,
was a
again,
law.
it took until 1965 to put that into writing, first of all. But hey, clearly there was some sort of realization that maybe people who were brought to the UK through like the Windrush boat were like, oh, you know, being treated unfairly and being mistreated in general. It's likely. Like, again, like I said, I wasn't there. I can only tell you what this legislation was about. So in 1968, then, there's like this Commonwealth Immigrants Act which passes, which at that point blew my mind, okay? Because it just blew it. So essentially, British passport holding Asians that were expelled from Kenya, which became independent in December 93, were prohibited from coming to the UK if their father or grandfather wasn't born here.
Okay.
Right. So, at that point, I'm like, Britishism, I guess, like in 1968, was all about, like, who's your dad? Like, where's your dad from? What he do? Where, like, was he born here? If so, sure, come on down. But if not, like, sorry, you're gonna have to go back to Asia, I suppose. Which, again, like, Asia's huge. So, like, to just be like, oh, British holding Asians, but it you know what I mean? That's, like, semantics. So, I found this to be extremely patriarchal, first of all. Which, again, like, in 68 doesn't necessarily surprise me. But the idea that, like, you know, this is what constitutes Britishness, is, like, if you have a father or grandfather that, like, was born here and that is British and stuff. And so what is it? Like, do you need like male British white blood in your veins to be a part of this country? Like, that again, this is my personal opinion, I'm getting very weird, like, white race is the best race vibes. I'm getting very Aryan race is the best race vibes. And this is 20 plus years after the end of World War II. And you're still out here talking about you need to have been born in this country. Again, you can say, like, oh, but no, if, you know, so-and-so was, like brought on here and, like, and, you know, was born, if they're, let's say, South Asian, and they had been born here in, like, the 40s and then moved to Kenya and stuff, oh, no, you can come back, whatever. Again, like, you need to be specific about these things because it can be twisted and, like, misinterpreted. Like, what if at that point, I'm thinking from the perspective of someone that can, like, I'm not saying I can argue law, right? But if you're playing, like, devil's advocate, then there's the question of, like, oh, well, was his dad born here? Was his dad born here? Sorry, I can't let you in. Based on this basis, like, you don't have this, like, patriarchal lineage that we're looking for. Exploded. And by the way, okay, this is where I just lost it, because this whole idea of, like, oh, the left, Democrats, Labor, they're for people of color, they're there for us, it's the right and Republicans and conservatives that are against us. This is a Labor government that passed this in a record 7 days. Quick to agree with it. Quick. Clinton was a Democrat in it.
Yes. No lies. I see no lies.
So, again, this whole idea of, like, now having these, like, race politics of, like, if you're on the right, if you're a conservative, if you're a Republican, you're racist, that is so not true. Because it is on literal both sides. Can't remember which rapper said it, but right wing, left wing, it's the same bird. I saw it on Instagram. Bless.
But it makes me think of the conversation. I think you and I had this conversation last night, and probably on the last episode, where we talked about the scariest thing that's come out of the past month or however long we've been doing this podcast was Amy Cooper, right? She was the quintessential New York white woman liberal. You and I have both seen the video. If you haven't seen the video, take a moment, go see the video.
Please take your phone off.
Please don't come close to me.
I'm taking pictures calling the cops.
Please call the cops. Please call the cops.
I'm going to tell them there's an African American man threatening my life.
Please tell them whatever you like.
And there is a man, African American, he has a bicycle helmet. He is recording me and threatening me and my dog. There is an African American man, I am in Central Park. He is recording me and threatening myself and my dog.
I don't have a better term than she weaponized her whiteness on this black man.
That's what that was.
And she and this is what we're talking about when we say, like, understand your allyship, understand your liberalism, because a lot of times it is rooted. It's like my friend said this yesterday. If your feminism isn't intersectional, I don't want it, because there's still racism in it. And it's the same with being liberal. There's still roots of racism in it. It's thinking about even like in the U.S. context, when we talk about parties, in the time of like the Voting Rights Act in the South, black people like John Lewis had to fight for black Democrats to be included on tickets and be included in voting processes during the Civil Rights era.
It's ridiculous.
But that's what we're talking about. When you and I talk about there are systems. You just listed laws in Britain, right? Which have ramifications today for why black people struggle with employment. Why do we have a 9% unemployment rate of black people in the UK right now? Because of the residual effects of things like the Race Act that you just mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is what we're talking about. That is the problem. There are systems and laws and policies which get enacted in practice and then disproportionately affect black and brown bodies. Period.
Yeah. Yeah. No, like it's so right. And like the thing is, like, so obviously around the time when the Race Equality Act, oh my God, am I saying it right even? Like yes, the Race Relations Act. It doesn't, I mean, it's been, yeah, it doesn't exist like that anymore. But essentially they like created a commission, you know, for like this racial equality stuff and stuff. And the thing is that in 2004-5, it was basically the Commission for Racial Equality was absorbed into the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which removes, for me, does the same thing as like the whole BAME demographic situation. Ooh. It removes the specificity of like the various forms of discrimination and societal issues that exist, for which the Commission for Racial Equality was addressing, right? So they absorb that into the Equality Human Rights Commission. The budget just plummets. They cut it insanely. They go from 70 million pounds in 2010 to 17 in 2015. And this is, at this point, there's like a conservative government. Like if I remember correctly, yeah, at that point, like the conservatives are already in power. So like, is it shocking necessarily? No. But plummets. They didn't even try to little bit, just took it out completely. And so this commission also like was overseeing, again, a number of discriminations that would essentially require like a commission for each one of them, technically speaking, if we were really trying to nip the issues in the bud and like really trying to address them and correct them. And then there's this whole, which, again, yesterday I just like, yeah, I was having just incredible moments in front of my computer by myself. But essentially, there's a hotline that you can call if you have a problem, I guess, if you're being treated unfairly because of your race. But this hotline doesn't provide legal advice. It's subcontracted by this commission to the Equality Advisory Support Services, which is in itself run from a telemarketing company that's based in Nashville. So a hotline that's supposed to take racial like inequality complaints is based in Tennessee.
But it's servicing the UK?
Yeah.
Okay, please continue while I sit here and process what you're saying.
Like, this is and again, I'm getting this all from this article that was written by this Jenny Bourne from 2015. Obviously, we'll absolutely link it. Like, please feel free to also correct me if I got something wrong. Like, we are here to learn and live. Like, not an issue. This is a conversation opener. Do you know what I mean? So it's this idea that, like, kind of like this whole thing of 37 cities having BLM across their, like, main avenues, but only one state removing qualified immunity. In this country, it was like, we've got this commission, we've got this, You've got more and more people of color that are, integrating government. Fine, great, whatever. It's all for show. Because none of it's an attitude change, but it's not a system change. It has nothing to do with actually fixing the problems that exist in this country. You have Trevor Phillips, who used to be the chair, the head, I'm not good with, like, technical terms, but basically used to run the, like, Equalities and Human Rights Commission.
Right.
This man is a black man. He might not he might say, oh, I'm actually this. Bruh, you as melanated as us. Like, this is what's happening. This guy literally made a comment in 2005 talking about, we can't be sleepwalking into, like, these racial divides and da-da-da-da-da. Like, we can't blame everything on white racism. Like, we need to recognize some things for ourselves. A black man is saying this.
Yikes.
My, again, personal opinion, but my issue is that, like, you cannot, he's a part of the system that, like, will push for him to call for, like, this integration, and will push for him to call for, like, black people or POCs to, like, realize their worth and da-da-da-da-da and put in the work and, all this stuff. But then you can't say that and then not turn around at the very people creating the system and go, okay, guys, maybe if we want them to be able to succeed this way, we also need to, like, alleviate some things, remove certain things. We need to, like, make space for this to happen, for them to exist. Even in the case of, like, intersectionalities of, like, other issues and things like feminism and stuff, like, in terms of climate change, like, you can't address the issue of climate change without turning around and realizing that the global south, as it's been coined now, has been suffering from climate change for decades. And no one has, like, not that no one has ever said anything, but, like, where was Extinction Rebellion at 15 years ago?
Yikes.
Or 25 years ago? Like, I'm very glad that they're here now. Don't get me wrong. It's great to see people, like, actually all come together like this and, like, really come to realize that, like, you know what? We actually all live in this one system. But this ain't news. This been happening. And it's the idea of, like, looking at these problems in the face while ignoring the fact that, like, the very source is coming from behind you. And whether it's a sense of, like, naive, like, blissful ignorance, or whether it's a case of just actually ignoring it, it's still there. And it's still going to cause the same damage if you don't address it in the back. You know what I'm saying? Like, when you have people like Trevor Phillips saying this stuff of, like, we can't be sleepwalking into segregation, which, first of all, you don't sleepwalk into segregation, but that's a different story. And then you've got David Cameron, who's like, oh, we need to make sure that British values really come through in who we are and how we educate our kids. What are British values? The man said it was, like, freedom. Okay, freedom for who? Freedom for the British government or the British country or the British people to have a say in every single part of the world, no matter where it's at, no matter if anyone even invited them to the table, or freedom for British POCs to actually exist in a country that, for some of them, like, this is their home, this is where they're from, this is their cultural identity. what is that freedom? You know, it's again, tolerance, sure, has gone up. People still racially abuse others in the street randomly. Like, it does happen. I was victim of that. But acceptance isn't there. Equality isn't necessarily there. BLM. It's been peaceful in the UK. And then and then you have the English Defence League come through drunk as like most of them were drunk. I'm sorry to say, like, if you were there and you weren't, let us know what happened. Because like, as far as I could tell, people were slurring and talking about this ain't no racist country, whatever. Like, no. And then talking about, I just can't, like, what are British values? Are those the British values that you're talking about? Is it the fact that, like, you should be support, like...
No,
does it mean being white? Is my question.
Your questions are correct, because in all honesty, they're the same questions that you and I have talked about in the U.S. context. Who gets to be a citizen? Who gets these unalienable rights? Who is afforded, as Frederick Douglass, who is afforded liberty and justice? Because it's been made abundantly clear through these laws that you've referenced, like the Race Relations Act, through these systems that we've talked about in the U.S. context, like Jim Crow and its continued nuances of the war on drugs and the current era of mass incarceration, it's been proven that systemically, we are not being afforded those rights. We are not being afforded those same opportunities. There is no sense of equity or equality for Black people, whether we be talking about in the UK context or the US context. What we keep seeing is changes in vernacular, changes in like semantics around old legislation and old policies that allow these things to exist. You talked about the politics of the matter, right? And I'm sure, and I want you to touch on what the current labor leader had the audacity to say the other day.
Girl.
But I think about, see, exactly. I'm going to let you breathe and we're going to come to it. But I think about the U.S. context, right? People herald and hail the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which we all know is important because it got rid of things like poll taxes and literacy tests. Or I know I've been told stories about people would literally have, like, like those gumball dispensers. There would literally be gumballs in a dispenser, and they would say, Black person, tell me how many numbers of gumballs are in this thing, and then you can vote if you can get it correct. Let that sink in.
Stop! That's like a lot of... Oh my God.
No, let it sink in. So we know that the goal of the Voting Rights Act was to get rid of things like that. But today, like in 2020, all we're seeing is new forms of voter suppression, right? Now we have things like voter ID laws, which, like, the ACLU reported that 36 states have voter ID laws. I think 7+ of them require you to have a government ID. There are 21 million U.S. citizens that do not have a government ID. Would you like to take a guess of the majority of people that don't have a government ID? Because I can guarantee you they're Black and brown. And I can guarantee you the reasons usually are economic or others, which are proven by systemic disenfranchisement. There's things like voter registration restriction. We are required to bring a passport or a birth certificate. Again, who are we disenfranchising? We're not even talking about stuff like voter purging, where they decided, we're getting rid of names because people have moved or people have died, etc., etc. Well, please explain to me why the Brennan Center did a study from 2014 to 2016 and 16 million Americans were excluded from voter purging.
Didn't this, like, I saw this figure the other day that, like, there was like millions of Americans that were counted in a census, but they were all like, rest in peace, but they were all dead. And like, that wasn't taken into account at all about like the fact that, did you even check to see the living status of this person?
Well, the reason that in 2020 people, especially black people, are pushing so hard that people do their census. Do your census if you're in the States and you haven't done it yet. Do your census.
Facts. Please, 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 please.
But it's because of things like gerrymandering and redistricting and redlining for that exact reason that you just talked about. All of those things are important in general, but when they are used in a negative way, such as gerrymandering, allow for people to not get seats. When we think about Kentucky or Georgia, right? Georgia was already in hot water when we all know Stacey Abrams should have beat Brian Kemp.
Girl.
But here we are in 2020 and we're looking at Fulton County and they have lines starting at like 6 a.m. and you've got people there until 7, 8 p.m. waiting to vote in black neighborhoods. Or in Kentucky, we're in Jefferson County, which has the largest population of black people in the entire state of Kentucky. Because of COVID, they went down from 3,700 polling places in 2016 to 200.
Sorry, 37,000.
3,700 to 200.
Ridiculous still. It's like, that's 3,500 polling places gone. So.
In the highest population of black people. This is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
These systems are what we're talking about. Laws keep getting new names. These cycles keep getting reborn. That's the problem. We're still seeing the ramifications of stuff that happened 40, 50, 60, 200 years ago.
Yeah.
Disproportionately affecting black people today. And I think your whole point, and the whole point that I've taken away from you talking about the laws in the UK is, it's not an America problem.
No.
It's a capital W West problem. I think it's really easy for people to be like, oh, well, the UK, like, these laws aren't codified. Well, we just gave you laws on the books, did we not?
Yeah.
That proves to you how black people in the United Kingdom are also being systemically disenfranchised.
Yeah.
Right? And we're not even talking about, as we alluded to earlier, which I really know the people want to because we paused, and now we're going to come back to talking about the current faction of labor. These are supposed to be, for our American listeners, labor is the equivalent of like the liberals, the Democrats in the States. These are supposed to be the ally.
Like Jeremy Corbyn equals Bernie Sanders type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
The way I see it, both of them are activists who became politicians, and both of them are like badly regarded by their own party. But,
Digress.
I have a soft spot for him because I'm an activist. I'm like, oh, I get it. But yeah, no. So Keir Starmer, okay. I don't necessarily actually have much of an opinion on him because I don't know. I don't have Labour membership. I didn't vote for, I didn't vote for him to become.
Can you vote?
Labour leader. Yeah, as French, I could vote in but I couldn't in December for some reason. I'll think about it later. But essentially, so of course, BLM starts, this whole thing, Black Lives Matter, great. Keir is like, labor leader, I gotta do my thing, posts a photo of himself kneeling, as you would expect, because even Nancy Pelosi, kneeled, you know what I mean? So there's this whole thing of, the left really showing its support to the point where they're kneeling, because, that's important. Okay, yes. The man was on TV a couple days ago talking about...
There's a broader issue here, the Black Lives Matter movement, or moment, if you like.
What?
I was so mad, because I was like, you don't get to kneel, you don't get to show this support, right? This very surface level, IG worthy support, okay, to get you some likes and to go up in the polls or whatever, if you're then gonna turn around and completely bring down everything that people have been working for decades. Forget the fact that it's just that BLM started in 2013 after George Zimmerman and stuff. I'm not even talking about BLM. I'm talking about the fact that, like, you have people that have been fighting for this, that have been fighting for, like, equality and for justice, literally since, like, the 1940s, 50s, since the 1920s, hell, since the end of slavery in itself. And you're gonna turn around after having taken a knee and have gotten whatever, all kinds of appreciation from your fellow voters and from fellow citizens, talking about this is a moment and therefore this is why we're never gonna defund the police. Bruh. Really? Really? This is what I mean when I say that it's like attitude and that it's got nothing to do with like actual promise or action. Okay? You have people that are, you have an article that came out, a story that came out like a couple years ago, like 5 years ago, where you had 2 women that were refused entry into a club for being too dark and too fat. You have the situation that happened a couple of days ago where you have a British athlete who happens to be black, but she is like, you know, a pride of Britain and stuff when it comes to like showing off her athletic skills in a competition, in like an international competition. She and her husband, partner, I'm not entirely sure what their like link is, but they have a baby together. The baby was in the car with them. They got stopped. They got pulled over. They both were like searched and they had their child with them. And this is someone that is absolutely not this like stereotypical version thought of like, oh, they're black, they must be suspicious, da 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 da. This is someone that's like representing this country whenever she's doing her thing, whenever she's doing her like, whenever she's showing off her skills, like her passion, her job. It's insane. It's insane. And it hurts. It hurts to see it happen like that. And it hurts to see that these are still things that this is just how things continue to be. You have to excuse me. I'm quite an emotional, sensitive person in general. But even in France, like, I was looking up to see if there was like any sort of like racial laws like this. And aside from the one against Jews during World War II, like most of them date back literally to colonialism and to the idea that like, you know, this is there was a penal code that was put out in like the 17th century or 18th century about like, this is the black code, like this is the slave code, like this is what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do, how you should treat them, da 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 da. The whole idea that like they're naive, gentle beasts that you need to baptize and that you need to like, you know, mold and create so that they don't turn into these savages that are gonna kill you. Like, that legislation dates from centuries ago, and yet the same year that they passed this Immigration Act thing in 68, you also have someone from labor that, I forget what his name is, but I'm going to find it in a second. Enoch Powell, I don't know how you say that first name, but literally says a fear-mongering speech. And again, I'm going to paraphrase, but bringing about the idea of like, they're going to come in here and they're going to rape our women and our daughters and they're going to steal your jobs and they're going to stab you in the street because they don't know any better and we cannot become the US. Because at the time in 68, what was happening? Bare civil unrest, right? So we cannot become like this, da 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 da. Like we this influx of immigration is a lot to like, we cannot be setting ourselves up down this line. It's in motion. It's been created. You have 2 options at that point. You accept it and you recognize the fact that like, at the end of the day, what did you say? That's like tikka masala is like the British dish. You accept it and recognize that like, this is what was happening, that like as a great empire, as a great nation, that you have had this influence and thus it will come back to you. You either accept that or you go the other way and you completely disenfranchise, ridicule, dehumanize people that are citizens of this country, of whatever. You're taking away those liberties and that freedom. And to have the Brexiteer national talking about, oh, we need British values, so and so and so and so. Dude, no, like, this is not how these things work. You cannot be out here saying, like, these are British values, but then not going into, like, what it means then to have these values. What is that freedom that you're talking about? What is that economic, like, prowess that you're talking about? If there's no definition, it's easily twistable. And that's what keeps happening. That's why Brexit turned into such a racial issue. Because it then became about immigration. And instead of thinking of the point of view of like, oh, we're a part of this like economic union. Like, I'm not saying that everyone who voted for Brexit is do you know what I mean? Like, that is absolutely not what I'm saying. But it did turn into a racial issue at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah. And I honestly think that is exactly where we should leave people. Because your authentic emotion about this issue is exactly what we're talking about. I've said this before, but people who are new to this party, new to this understanding, you have to recognize that there are people who are living this experience and who are living this trauma. There are people who have felt this for generations and are fighting now more than ever because, unlike what was said, this is a movement, not a moment. We are not just fighting a singular issue, as people have talked about. We are not just fighting the low rung of police brutality. We are not just fighting one issue. We're not just in the street for no reason. We are talking because there are systems that are killing us. There are systems that are denying us rights that we should have for simply existing. So when we said at the beginning of this episode, Jim Crow did not die. He did not die. We saw that in every single legal and policy example that we gave you in this moment. These are all things that Mel and I have looked up, talked about, feel deeply about, because we know that they are affecting our people, whether we be here in the United Kingdom, in her home country of France, or back in the US. There are systems that are globally disenfranchising Black people, and now is the movement in which we are saying no more. We're not taking it. We're not having it. No more semantics, no more random changes. We want systemic change. So for me and all of our US listeners, do not forget to do your census. Do not forget to vote. And I do not mean for Kanye. Vote with purpose. But read about these things. Have these conversations. We're giving you entry points, not fact end all be alls. Engage with us. Engage with each other. And do not let this movement die. Capture this opportunity and keep fighting, because I know that we are.
Amen. Agreed. Entirely. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks for coming. We appreciate it. Please make sure you are liked and subscribed, whether you're on Spotify or YouTube. Check us out on all forms of our social media if you're missing us in between our 2-week break. We really appreciate you. Thank you for giving us this level of catharsis. And thanks again for coming to Got Melanin.
Everybody gather round and listen to my song.